And you're live.
Am I live? All right.
Live.
Okay, so we are very happy and lucky to have here Professor Beatrice de Gelder from, and I'll have trouble saying this, but Maastricht University in the Netherlands. Many of you know of her work. She has been a pioneer in all kinds of research of interest to people here in BBS. So certainly my perspective, my selfish perspective, is that she has studied emotion perception in bodies and faces really for a very long time and has been a pioneer in the study of sort of body posture and body, the relationship of body posture and so on to emotion. And she's done that both from the behavioral side and from the neural side. So that's great. She's also done some really fabulous work with unconscious perception in neurological patients. And some people online, maybe from my CogSci class, it's her Scientific American article from a couple of years ago is a fan favorite, student favorite in my class on Blind Sight. So she has worked for a very long time in lots of different areas as an expert on these things. I've known of her work and known her for years, but I ended up running into her recently in Istanbul at a, of all things, an IEEE Face and Gesture conference where she was a keynote speaker. And she informed me that she would be at Columbia University for the semester, and wouldn't it be fun if she came down? So I was delighted to take advantage of that wonderful opportunity. And here she is. So introducing Beatrice. Beatrice's talk, Basic Body Perception for Action and Emotion Perception. And that's all I'll say.
Thanks, Alice. It's great to be here. And of course, we share this common interest, and it's great to see some people from when I was working on different things, but we have some new stuff on Blind Sight now, which is actually quite fascinating. But that's not for this talk. Actually, when you talk about my career, my career started when I was 52. So wow, this is appropriate to mention the center of longevity that I changed disciplines. I changed disciplines when it was about. And if you look up, my first scientific articles are going to be early 50s or so. So just to apologize for my not so long scientific career. Anyway, I got interested in that one.
Can we hear her? Is it loud enough?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, she's soft. Okay.
It's okay?
I was just checking for the online. Okay.
Yeah, because I don't see where the microphone is standing. Will you hear me correct? It is that thing. Okay. Right. So decided one evening, why is everybody forever talking about studying face perception, and what about body perception? So that was one evening when I was at NGH in Boston, and we said, well, we have to make around stimuli. So that's how all this started. And since body perception has been we are still the minority on a minority, and it's still quite intriguing why body perception is so slow to take off. It's not, but anyway, it'll be okay. Good. Interestingly, there is, of course, when I just added this slide, which I was in India, there is a very, very long tradition in, for example, in psychiatry, before any kind of imagery and narrow looking at the brain was available, people had to judge mental illnesses by their appearances. And there is actually saw this at a very interesting art exhibition in Salzburg like 2 summers ago. There's a long tradition of people working on body expressions, and one specific body expression is called the arch of hysteria. And here you see that, and here you see it, and there's some sculptures, quite some sculpture about that. It's this almost impossible. You see the woman there, she's specifically displaying the body posture, which is called the arch of hysteria. It's like folding, going over in almost impossible. And it's all the clinical handbooks have that. Anyway, good. Let's get to business. My interest in I'm a very reluctant social neuroscientist because I'm really not very interested in the not very interested in occupying myself with studying the high-level processes of social cognition, because that's just not my field, that's just not the focus of my interest. What I am interested in is what you could call social vision, like vision sciences dedicated to social phenomena. And the body, of course, is one major source of signals of social vision. So in the very first paper we did with the self-made stimuli at the time, we this was actually the very first MRI paper on bodies. And we didn't have any specific theory, but we ended up regrouping the brain areas, and this is like a very first, very in a way complete but very naive paper in terms of hypothesis. But it gives you the different centers of the brain that are involved in emotional body expressions. Emotional, for a while I called it emotional body language. I'm not very happy with that expression. But interestingly, in all the subsequent studies that have used bodies, still or dynamic, as images, all those areas have been seen as playing a role. So interestingly, anecdotically interestingly, the kind of the activation we found in the brain for the contact, neutral and defensive, neutral and fear reactions, they have all come up in all the subsequent studies, even without any kind of really sharp or clear hypothesis. So that's that in a way that defines the broad area. Just to go 20 years later from a study we just submitted, one thing, and that connects to conscious, non-conscious processing, is we played a while ago with spatial filtering of the images and trying to see whether of all the brain areas we saw involved there was some selective processing as a function of the spatial filtering. So you see here the spatial filtering, and we do find if we compare that original image, this one, with what we find here, we see indeed that depending on the kind of spatial filtering, from low to high spatial filtering, different brain areas are dealing with bodily fear expressions, and that corresponds roughly to the more motor related areas, to the more cognitive related areas. So that's just a, but I'm not going to talk about perception of emotional body expressions. What's happened over the last years is that I got more interested in like the visual side of the processing. What is it? Well, because it's all very well that there is social signal processing, but how does the brain pick out? I mean, what are the basic visual mechanisms that make you pick out a stimulus as a conspecific body or so? So this talk is really going to be about those processes. So what body information is critical for body perception, and by extension for action and emotion understanding? And of course, there are a bunch of candidates. There's lots of information carried by the body, just as there is lots of information carried by any object, of course. Like you can you can look at optical flow, you can look at shape features, you can look at at overall postures, etc. And you can do dynamic visual analysis. So where do we start and how do we go about understanding is there any specificity at this level of processes for bodies? There is a traditional approach that's certainly familiar to all of us. I call it the traditional approach because it's been with us as long as we have had that MRI studies for cognitive processes, and it's sort of parcellate the cortex in category areas. Like for very many people, that has been like the thing to do first and foremost. So sort of see if you can assign specific areas to specific object categories. And that's what people have done, of course, independently of the kind of work we did on emotional expressions. But I mean, the departure for any kind of study is to see whether you can find a brain area that does it, and let's go take it from there. And as is often the case if you look at the recent history, people find there is one area that has categorical specificity. That okay, that's the area in the brain that does bodies. Of course, 5 years later, a second area is found. We've seen this happen for faces. We've seen this happen for body. And there is a second area that also does bodies, which is a little bit more anterior, possibly here. And then you get to the. So that's. These two are still in the literature, like the canonical areas that are involved in body processing, in first stage of body processing. We find similar situation in monkey, where also there are the locations, of course, are different, but where also there's two areas that seem to be devoted to processing, to the entry stage into the processing of bodies. However, when you look at the literature, you see that it doesn't stop with two areas. That the picture very quickly gets complicated. If you, for example, even if you look at the top half of my image, if you look for still images, people have found a whole bunch of body areas that are selective, that are sensitive. You see, sensitive rather than selective. That are sensitive for bodies. When you go to dynamic images, which are of course much more naturalistic, they have posture information, but mostly also movement, dynamic information. You see that across the brain, selectivity for dynamic body movement is widespread across the brain. So how does that, or question is, how does that help understand what the basic mechanisms are that are? Meanwhile, we did some MEG studies, and you see, for example, here that body selectivity, as opposed to compared to scrambles for the different categories, that you have a peak, you have a fairly early peak for body selectivity in the brain, in the posterior brain. And it's certainly more stronger than it is. These are still images, and it's certainly stronger than it is for bodies, and also it's a little bit anterior than it is for faces, than it is for objects. But bodies somehow stand out very, very clearly in the early stages of visual perception. Furthermore, when you compare not neutral bodies, but you go into images, this is a later MEG study from 2015, I believe, where you see at the very early stage you actually have within a 100 millisecond window with this MEG technique, you see that the brain notices right side and the right side cortex. That's another issue to discuss. You see that there's the sensitivity to emotional expressions. So all of that is like a complication for models that build on there being separate areas, because as I said, the traditional picture is you find the area that is selective for the stimulus you're interested in. You define that as the entry level into the processing, and then any kind of attributes like identity, gender, attractiveness, all that is processed once the specificity the area has been assigned. Okay. So that's the sort of the classical model, but that's the model or data, and certainly your data on early activity seem to I wouldn't say contradict, but seem to make problematic. And in the last couple of years, we've worked with something of an alternative thing, where we basically, I'll get you the gist of it, given that body perception seems to be spread over a bunch of different brain areas. We don't know what each area does. So a sensible thing to do is to see, well, actually, if body representation is spread out over different areas, maybe what's happening in those different areas is that they compute features. They don't need a full conceptual representation of the body, but they compute features. And then the question is, what are those features? So here is like the outline, and I hope I get over time. Don't tell me that. So I'm going to show you some studies where we try to argue that body sensitivity is a network function. It's not a function that it can be allocated to one brain area. Second, that different expressive bodies, different emotional expressions, for example, they are sustained by differential network activity. third, some data on what we believe are features that are coded at that level. And then last part is what are these features actually built from? So that's the simple storyline. So as I said, rather than looking for areas and then for how then an area sends its information to more anterior areas, we decided to go straight away for a complete bottom-up network construction. So we used this is completely bottom-up approach to see how the brain reacts to bodies. So we use these techniques, which some of which are certainly familiar to you, and this is the stimulus set we used. These are dynamic videos. We have human bodies, monkey bodies, and objects, each with their scrambled counterparts. And for these studies, I'm just really going to give you the gist of what's going on there. So what in this completely bottom-up approach using ICA, we do find a bunch of you find a bunch of networks. In this case, we could extract a whole lot of networks, and some of these were specifically sensitive to the body images, as opposed to the face and the object images. And there you see, and the interesting thing is, in this approach, you don't assign activity to an area, but you assign activity to the network and the node. The specificity comes from the relation between that node and the other areas. So the specificity is not located, let's say, in the body area or in fusiform body area, but it is the relation it is the activity that's in that network. Okay, so here we could then show, this is just going on a little bit along the same lines. We could see that we could see condition-dependent network nodes in that for coding bodies. And sorry, I forget one important point. What comes out, you can't see it that clearly, but what comes out, and most interestingly, is we find here that there is that. Given the species comparison we have, we find that there is specificity for the human body, very strong specificity for the human body as opposed to the monkey, which is quite intriguing because movements with the movement at the lower level, physical and movement aspects were controlled with the scrambles. If no control is perfect, of course, but they were controlled for. And we see that human body specificity emerges in this kind of network. So we find that the human brain actually codes in a unique way what the specific dynamic characteristics are of the human body. We did that same study using EEG. Using first still images. I'm going to go a little bit faster with this, using still images with EEG, but also using dynamic images also. This is from the most recent one, where we use where we look for body selectivity processes using the dynamics, and again controlled with their scrambles. And here also we find that there is early specificity and preferential treatment for the human body, which is, but if the specificity arises, again, maybe I repeat myself, again, not by higher activation in one specific area, but by higher activity of that network consisting of spread out over different areas in the brain. Of course, EEG is a different kind. So we were kind of sort of intrigued by finding this because, as you see, and when I shall talk about kinematics and about biomechanical things, there may be a relation between those. So the movement of the human body triggers a specific activity early on in the processing system, and it's different for humans and monkeys. What I want to say, we are actually running, this project is run together with people working on monkey and doing doing monkey electrophysiology and monkey FRI. And interestingly, those are not published data, but interestingly, we know from those studies that we find a very similar pattern in monkey. So monkey brain preferentially activates to monkey bodies and not to human bodies, even if these are monkeys in captivity that have been certainly exposed since since the whole lifetime to human caretakers, to interacted with humans, etc., etc. So monkey body will preferentially code for the site, the activity, the dynamics of monkey body. And the monkey brain actually shows even less activity to a human body than the human body shows to monkey body. In the monkey body, there is a clear preference in the human body, there's a clear preference for the human body, but there is still comparatively some activity for the dynamics triggered by the dynamics of the monkey body. But in the monkey body, it's really very straightforward. The monkey body does not activate much to the side of humans. I sort of find that intriguing since, I mean, they're good. A little bit about the usefulness of having this network approach now to understanding body expressions, like mainly what we work with is defensive and aggressive actions. So remember in the classical model, the brain codes the body and then sends that code, let's call it that code, sends that code to the areas dealing with emotional recognition. In this network perspective, things are different. That what we see here, what we try to see here, what we find is that the difference between different expressive body movements is actually a network function. You have different sub areas of the network activate differently when the body is not neutral but expresses an aggressive, represents an aggressive or a defensive action. One problem with the body area all along has actually been that this area, if you look at it, look at it anatomically, it falls apart in a bunch of different areas, and that's often sort of passed over because nobody really knows what to do with it. I mean, so we keep talking about the body area while in fact it partly overlaps with MT. It's a complex area, as you can see there. So with this, one positive fallout from our network approach has been that we see that if we look into meaningful body expressions like aggression or defensiveness, these sub areas play a different role. They are differentially involved in body representation depending on. So it's not like this body area sends information to then process emotion, but it's an integrated thing that takes place in this. Maybe I should not spend too much on this one. So what we did here, as I said, we first define the network, and then we draw into the network aggressive actions or defensive actions, and we see how the components of them, or how not even the components, but how the relations between the components of the network activate differently, as depending on whether it's a defensive or aggressive action. Now, I don't have time to get into the clinical implications of that, but they are quite intriguing, promising. So we see differences. We see differences at network connectivity level between the different emotional actions. Good. So far we have we have an internal, call it loosely speaking, the brain has an internal model of its own body. Yeah? Call it like that, loosely speaking. And you may say, well, we've always thought that, we've always said that, but anyway, I mean, that's the kind of evidence we are showing that. And it's that internal model of the own body which is actually modulated when you see somebody being aggressive or being defensive. Now, now I get to the question about features. So what is actually characteristic about these different body movements. And here we look at, do they have different features? So now I'm going to present you some work we did on the features. Of course, bodies have different features going from low level to mid level, to what we call mid level to high level features. High level features are, of course, emotions. And that's the low level features are physical features. So what we are looking at specifically, our hypothesis about what is coded in those networks. As I said, it's not abstract body concept, but what is coded in those networks are mid-level features. Some examples of that are, for example, distance between the limbs. When the distance between my hand and my shoulder is very small, then it means that I'm involved in one kind of action and not in another one. When I welcome you, the distance between my hand and my shoulder is going to be big. Okay? When I'm aggressive, the distance is going to be small. So based on that kind of feature characteristics, we try to see how different expressions are coded. So that's the same for orientation and postures. So here, what we do here is code videos and derive from the videos. You use your software to code the videos, and once you have the key points marked, you can of course calculate frame to frame the difference between the key points, and you can define features. That's one thing. That's one thing we did here. Then you can use representation similarity analysis, and you analyze. You get your features through representation similarity analysis. Then the next thing is you compare that to your brain activity. You see how your representational similarity matrix maps onto your brain activity. And that should give you a neural representation of your features. Okay. So so you have your feature, your video analysis, your definition. Yeah, another feature we looked at. So we have to, once you have the key point analysis, you have to define features. So another one, for example, here is symmetry. We have velocity, symmetry, contractions, a bunch of features you can define. We actually, in this study, we choose to find some features in the literature, like velocity is going to be a feature of aggressive behavior as opposed to, for example, sad behavior. So we took that from the limb contraction. Surface occupied by the body is also an indication. Somebody who's like very angry is going to occupy the body. Overall, there's going to be less surface covered by the features than by an expansive body thing. Give you an overview for where it works nicely. So this works, for example, nicely for the feature representation that defines very well anger is limb defines very well fear is limb contraction. And when we project the feature analysis onto the brain, we find areas that are indeed, we find some more, but the ones we find are also very clear from the literature. So what we have done this way is gone from an intuitive common sense level of emotion description to one level below, what we call mid-level, where we can actually identify the features that make up that body movement. Okay, and then we find that those features are coded in areas that are known. Most of them, not all of them. We found some new ones that are known to be involved in coding that emotion. So that worked reasonably well. We thought that thing that's still reasonably interesting, but we were a bit uneasy because we had to choose features ourselves. I mean, there is no guidance. There's guidance in the literature about the features of an angry versus a defensive body, but they're common sense features, common sense descriptions. Yeah.
So in your last slide, this looks really cool. I want to make sure I'm understanding. Is it the participant posing? And so each RSA that you run on the different focus data, is that to the participant that they then see themselves in the scanner?
No, they don't see them. No, in the scanner they see videos.
It's videos of someone else.
In the scanner they just see short video clips.
Okay.
but we have analyzed those video clips in terms of their features.
Right.
And when, and then we analyze our brain imaging data through the filter of those features.
Uh-huh.
But the participants are just naively laying in the scanner and seeing the videos.
Okay.
Sorry if that wasn't clear. So we then tried, and this is work in progress currently, we then tried a more automated process of feature definition. Because I mean, one problem, as you know, with the emotion literature is that you sort of turn around in common sense categories. You replace one common sense category with another one, and you have the feeling you don't get a grip on things. And with this feature level, we thought we already came to get a grip on how the brain does it. Like you see an angry person, in fact, and in fact, or a fearful expression, and what your brain decodes is limb contraction. But that was already, we had a feeling we were getting somewhere with that kind of approach. But we wanted a broader and more automated feature search method. So that's what we tried. Then the approach is this is really a key that is but it's the same there. I'm very sorry about this slide. Yeah, okay. Anyway, so what we did, again, the point of departure is the same. There are different actions, but the point of departure is the same. Namely, do a post analysis of the videos, and then not define features yourself, but throw it all into some big ICA. Okay? Throw it all in some big algorithm for finding features. For finding clusters of things that go together in the post analysis. And we tried hierarchical clustering, which is one method, and you see how here how your different your left hand, right elbow. You see all your all your key points, your list of your key points, and you see what clusters with what in your analysis. And you can. So here we do not define in advance what we are looking for in the brain data, but we use these automatic clustering techniques. And then again, we just like in the previous study, we we have on the one hand the RDMs, and on the other hand the brain data, and we try to see to what extent we find a pattern in the brain data that corresponds to the features, in this case, the features generated by the ICA. And then we see what we find. Then we see what we find in terms of brain activity. Of course, the problem with those automated methods is that the advantage is that you're not biased by your subjective common sense understanding, but the problem is that it can always be done in different ways. Like we used sparse PCA. We also used hierarchical clustering, two completely different methods, and we try to see to what extent they converge and give us the same. So the basic idea remains to break apart the common sense understanding of the body and of its emotion, and bring it down to constituent parts at the feature level. Okay? Good. I mean, that's work in progress. This now I go to this feature work, as I said, is work in progress. But then the next question, remember, the first study I talked to you about the notion that the brain has a body model. So how does that the brain may have an internal body model? So now I want to see some relation between this internal body model and the feature analysis. Are the features like a disorganized alphabet floating around in the brain? Is there some scaffolding to the features? And that's where we get to, and that's how we get to some stuff we have been doing recently, looking at biomechanics of the body. Because somehow, of course, the features will have to respect the biomechanics. and there wouldn't be features otherwise. So there may be underlying and scaffolding this grammar of features is some kind of basic rule about the biomechanics of the body. And remember, we are not talking about the motor system here. We are really talking about the visual system. So this one I will skip. Okay, so that that's some recent work. Automatically, you'll see what's going on here. Looks pretty normal. This one looks pretty normal. These are avatars. However, look at this guy. Fast. Normally this should play automatically. They don't. All right. Animations are always okay. You see what's going on here, and you see what's going on here. Okay. So what what we did here is those avatars that were made on based on motion capture, etc., and mathematically modeled in such a way that we could change the movements of the joints. In that case, the upper arm and the knee, we could change them and make them biomechanically impossible. What you see there is a movement of the from the knee, the leg, and of the arm that is biomechanically not possible for the human body. This has to be done respecting degrees of freedom, etc., etc. Pretty complicated stuff, totally outside my competence, but done by a trusted collaborator. So that's good. And what we wanted to know is how does the brain deal with those biomechanically impossible? There have been some studies in the past on this, and I talk about that in the end, where people have tried that, but the stimuli were very poor. Like one study in the around 2010 looked at biomechanics of the human body and compared the movement of the arms with the movement of a corkscrew, those corkscrews that go up and down, that have two arms. Yeah. So of course, very many differences in the like the movements of the arms of a corkscrew are not in 3D. They are just they move in the plane. So there's there was not much work we could go by there in that study. So we created this full body images of biomechanically possible. This was a 7 Tesla MRI design, where I mean you have a bit of information on the conditions there. In terms of we had to validate the stimuli. We were they were made by animating mocap data. We had 60 of each, and there were 4 actions: kicking, jumping, pointing, waving. The joint angles were modified at the elbows and the knees to create 60 biomechanical impossible videos. Okay, so you get snapshots of that there. And we used, I think we scanned that 0.8 millimeter resolution. And as a consequence of scanning at 0.8, we could only have the back of the brain, because it's very intensive. You cannot keep the subjects in the scanner for more than 3 hours. But that's about. We used a localizer consisting of the contrast of bodies and objects, dynamic bodies and objects, etc. If you want more details about the scanning, you just ask me later. Good. So some and importantly, I'll say that next. So all sorts of stuff about scanning parameters, scanning processes. And the task subjects were, there was a passive one back task because we were not wanting to pay attention, to draw attention to any of the specific characteristics, and we want the subjects to pay attention similarly to possible and impossible ones, but we didn't want to give them any information about what the difference was. Similarly, had been validated beforehand, and out of 190 we choose 120, 60 on each side. Okay, I mean, I don't know, it depends on how much you're interested in this fMRI. We also looked at layers. We tried to, that's one reason why we took the scanner procedure, because we were interested in layer specificity, which is important to see whether what we find is actually a matter of feedback from higher areas, not. Very important, this was model-guided fMRI. Basically, the kind of the analysis was what is now in the literature as encoding. We look at how the brain is. We try to discover the encoding model that the brain is using, and to discover the encoding model of the brain, we use three different models. One is a categorical model, simply possible, biomechanically possible, impossible. The second is a similarity distance model, and the third is a key point position model. So basically what you do in this approach is you confront MRI data with three models, and you explain and you try to see which of the model explains best the variance you find. We defined EVA based on that localizer I said. Just to give you the gist of this, at the group level encoding results you see up there, that correspond very much. There is always a big difference between left and right EVA. And as you all know, the literature on laterality is a very complex and complicated issue. But here again, we find much better representation, even for this kind of stuff in the right hemisphere. What you see in the bottom, half of this image, you have this color coding for the model. You see green. Green is the categorical model. Blue is the similarity distance model, and red is the key point model. And you see, and that's quite intriguing, how all over EVA you see some shifting, but it's not so as you might have thought, that we go in a simple way from physical characteristics to mid-level characteristics to high level. You see that these three models are intertwined in the area. There is some progression from posterior to more anterior. The key point model, which is of course the one that is specific for coding the human body, becomes progressively more pronounced and progressively explains more of the variance in the voxel activity as we go from posterior to anterior. Now, at the level of the layers, we get a similar picture, actually. And if you on the left, on the right side, you see the different models. It's a little bit small, but you see the categorical model. You see, it's a little bit small. I apologize. But again, you see the difference between left and right hemisphere, and you see up there how this progression there. You see very clearly how this you get from green, basically from green through purple to red. That means that you get from the different models explain variance at different locations in occipitotemporal cortex there. But overall, 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 it is the 3 key point model that explains most of the variance in the, let's say, call it the body area, for lack of longer definition. Okay. So taken together, we find this to be evidence that already in fairly, I mean, it's not early visual cortex, of course, but already in occipital temporal cortex there is a specific coding for the biomechanics of the human body. It's not like the motor cortex has to come in there. It is present. It is a characteristic of the human body movement that is coded in occipital temporal cortex there, lateral occipital. So we are currently running some studies, including TMS studies, to clarify at least the contribution of motor cortex. You could say, well, this is top down from motor cortex to visual cortex. I mean, that would be an obvious critique comment possibility. And we want to exclude that because we really would like to argue that what happens, that biomechanics is coded in at that stage already in the visual system. And the fact that we find this pattern of layer specificity adds to the confirming or supporting at least that hypothesis. Okay. Good. Where does it all leave us? As I said, the very first study I showed about the whole brain network that has species specificity, of course, it's tempting to link that to the fact that we find this coding for the human body, and that you say, well, actually, what's going on? This specificity of the human, this internal human body model is actually a model of human body kinematics, or at least is one component of a human body of then the next question is, how did it get there? I mean, how does the brain come to have? You could call it, if you favored prediction theories, you could say, but what we find is that there is a prior in the visual system for human kinematics, kinematics. But how then? The question is, how does the predictive prior? How does it get there? And now, of course, we have the usual suspects. Say, we are born with it. I mean, it's quote unquote innate. There is some evidence that may look as if it suggests that. There is a study, there are very few studies who have looked into that. There's one study on newborns, I mean, 20, 40, 48-year-old, hour-old babies, and that study found that newborns will preferentially look at possible versus impossible hand movements. That's pretty early and pretty young. And if you want to read it that way, you could say, well, that's because the movement abilities of a 40 to 40 hour-old baby are not very developed. So that's one possibility. Another study looked at 1-year-old babies compared to adults, and they find they use a preferential looking paradigm, and they find that the 12-month-olds preferentially look at impossible arm movements. The possible arm movements don't attract much attention, but they really discriminate between possible and impossible arm movements. And in contrast with the adults, and that's a bit surprising, they discriminate, but they don't show pupil dilatation. So you could say, well, if you want to view pupil dilatation as an index of emotional arousal, then they say, well, they discriminate them, but there is no emotional arousal associated at 1-year-old with seeing impossible hand movements. What does that mean? What does that indicate? You can speculate about that. You would say, well, they are not yet in the framework of recognizing an action, because with impossible movements, you don't recognize an action. We have that from our own validation data also. So that would plead in favor of a separation between biomechanics, coding of biomechanics in the brain, and coding of action and emotional expressions, which is something I can live with, because I want to see this biomechanics as some very basic scaffolding of the. So that's a possibility. On the other hand, and this goes against the notion that this would be something the biomechanics prior the brain comes equipped with. Against that goes a study we did ourselves. There were actually very few studies on the developmental studies on body perception. We did one study of 16 to 18-year-olds, and we clearly find that there's canonical body sensitive areas in the brain are not yet fully developed. It takes still over 18 till you find the pattern of body perception in youngsters that you find in adults. So there is some component there also. Finally, the results I showed you also speak, as I already hinted at, speak to the question of bottom-up versus top-down. You might initially say, well, the fact that you find biomechanic sensitivity in lateral occipital cortex simply testifies to the presence or to the effectiveness of a top-down effect, because we have surprise effects, seeing impossible things, but that is against that notion of a clear separation, or results as have some other people recently show that there is a gradient, that it's not that any separation between bottom up and top down is a little overdone, and it is really along the axis from anterior to, from posterior to anterior in the visual system. There is a gradient of representativity of different models. It's not like one model wins out at one time and another next is succeeded by the next model. I mean, we have really a gradient in the cocktail, in the mixture of the different models. Okay, that was it for me. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thanks a lot for the talk. Me coming from the social cognition background, specifically looking at the rational actions, I wanted to be sure about, and that's one of your open questions as well, that how much is the component of all the networks that we are talking about is a matter of fact of biomechanics or an aspect of rational action? Because all the stimulus material that we have seen has some component of meaningful attached to it. So like we are kicking a ball, or we are having a dance motion. And there are literature about that even if we look at the line structure, which moves in the form of a human body, can activate the same kind of networks, which a rational action as well as the theory of mind networks are also activating. So did you, in your study, have tried to exclude the aspect of actions or rational actions from the biomechanics? And that's one of your open questions as well.
That's one of my open questions. You really are spot on there.
Yeah, and that seems like being so.
What
like,
we are,
when can I ask this question?
No. We in our behavioral evaluation, we ask the question. So we ask, they're given all the subjects are given all the stimuli. They're asked 3 questions. First, biomechanically possible, impossible. Second, do you see an action or not? And the third question, I forget. But the second question is, it correlates perfectly when they say it's biomechanically impossible. They don't say they recognize an action, which I find a bit difficult, because even with the biomechanically impossible ones, I can see actions still. Yes. For me, I was very worried about that from the beginning. There's a very much a top-down perception of an action in the biomechanical ones. But our behavioral data say that we are okay there. That does, of course, not stop the objection. So we are trying to see what we can do. And one thing we are currently envisaging for the TMS is compare the full stimulus length with a fragment where you still don't recognize an action. The question is, how short does it have to be for there not to be an action?
Right. So you also mentioned at one point that monkeys, looking at the monkey images or the videos, only activated those networks when they saw the monkey images,
Yeah.
not when they saw the
Yeah.
human. However, with the humans, it was also with the humans and also with the monkeys. So it's kind of a component of like a social rational action processes, which is irrespective of biomechanically not so recognizable actions, but it's a component of a human figure trying to decode the meaning behind any
Absolutely.
action.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That leaves the question why the monkeys are not interested in decoding the meaning of the human actions, of course.
Right.
So is that I turn your question around, is that because they don't get the biomechanics?
Well, at that
And
point,
why don't they get the biomechanics?
when you mentioned in your talk, we're also talking about the identity and how do we relate to our body image. And with with monkeys, whether we have that higher order hierarchical processing of the body image compared to humans that we have it. So there we have.
Absolutely. It's a constant struggle for us to study those things and trying to push aside those high order semantic aspects.
Exactly. Yes. And
But I mean, let's agree on what we mean by social. Like as I said in my beginning, we try to play things at the level of the visual system. Okay, but social does not need to mean higher order cognitive processes. I mean, they can as a stimulus. And that's a question: how does the brain pick out? By what does the brain pick out social stimuli?
control condition for it.
What
Changing the subject slightly, I was going to ask, there's this long, somewhat controversial literature about the idea of facial expressions being like 7 stereotypical species-specific facial expressions that are thought to be kind of coded, kind of biologically coded for expression, perception. I was struck by the idea that we might do the same sort of thing for body posture. So my question was, do you think of like, you talk about aggressive versus defensive body postures. Do you think that's part of a repertoire that's biologically coded in the same way that people have argued facial expressions are?
Absolutely. I have no problem with that. I think I mean, there's the controversy about the basic facial expression.
I know.
But a lot of that controversy for me is totally confusing. And you have to go back, you have to see for me, what makes a difference is in terms of the actions it elicits, not the mental processes it generates, and very clearly in all our studies we find from the very first one. I remember I entitled the very first one is, I found this title for the PNAS paper, fear triggers, what is it again? Fear fosters flight. That was the very first title I gave. It's in terms of, if you find, my criterion would be, if you find a clear action pattern that is triggered by the stimulus, then you have a candidate for whatever you want to call it.
So have there been cross-cultural studies to show that there is a commonality across cultures in interpretation, the body postures that we interpret?
We've done a bit of that, and we found some differences. And the differences we find are not, I should look that up again. I sort of lost interest in that. The differences we find are not in defensiveness and aggressiveness, but it is in sadness, for example. We find a big difference between Western and Japanese participants in sadness. Sadness is judged positive in Japan and negative here, that kind of stuff. So, but I mean, The same for faces. I mean, an aggressive face will. But the more we work on this, the more I realize that faces and bodies are very different. And not for the kind of question you raise, but in very many respects, like we often find faster reactions to bodies than we find to faces. And that has to do with a bunch of factors. And I think one of them is that that for faces, we tend to immediately code identity. Like an angry face, the identity matters. So you need to quickly code the identity. But for an aggressive body, it doesn't. You have to get out of the way, whoever it is. So that's the kind of. But for me to come back to the source, for me, biomechanics would fall into the category of social information.
Check, is there any online?
I would do it.
We don't have any questions online.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
I have a bunch of questions, but I hate to monopolize your time since I'll have a chance to talk to you later. So I'll. Okay, so I was fascinated about the sort of de-emphasis of the areas in favor of the more network perspective.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure I understand what you have in mind when you mean network mediated responses. And again, this might be a conversation to have over dinner or whatever, but I don't have a good sense of two things, how that changes the interpretation of what goes on in the areas, which is 80–90% of the literature, and even what goes on in terms of the different processing streams now,
Mm-hmm.
Ventral, dorsal, lateral. So just some thoughts on it, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe something to get my head around.
Well, this is
how you would know the difference exactly. When you showed a lot of evidence here that things
Yeah.
are not anywhere near as local as one would like, that this literature would like us to.
Yes. It took me a little while to wrap my head around this proper network interpretation, because what a proper network interpretation is not a matter of connectivity between the areas, but it's really saying that where the action is in the strength, it's in what the role a node plays in maintaining the connectivity. Because we have traditional connectivity analysis, which sort of followed up traditional category areas, right? You have categories, and then people say, okay, but they have to be connected. But so you still then identify separate categories. You just look at the functional connectivity between that. But the network view, as I sort of, maybe I'm too philosophical in this, as I would like to understand it, is really to say that what you measure, you have one single measure, which is a measure of the network connectivity, of what happens of the activity in the network, and then you can see which one. So you don't reason in terms of nodes and their connections. You reason in terms of overall activity
Across the.
Yes.
So the use of ICA in that context.
Yes.
Maybe that's like specifically, how would it get applied?
Yes.
Like you're looking for the source essentially of
Yes.
activity. So you're using it as a kind of source,
Yeah.
like the way it would be used in language.
And for the also we have some electrophysiology, and we have some MEG, but we would need much more of that. But when you contrast the information obtained from time-sensitive methods with the information obtained from very sluggish fMRI methods, you see this inconsistency. I mean, the models we have, like the cognitive models we have of brain processing, coming, of course, from the typical cognitive psychology of the 80s, are very much this box by box, moving box by box things. And fMRI was, of course, a gift from heaven for confirming this, in my view, misleading picture of the brain. And when you go to time-sensitive methods, like you really, it cannot be the way it's pictured in those box models. I mean, it has to be like almost instantaneous. Also, for example, for how you react to aggressive actions, and we know that from other studies, it's like instantaneous. It's very rapid.
That's been an argument for, I'm sorry,
No, please.
that's been an argument for the idea that these very rapid perceptual responses are entirely feed forward.
Yeah.
So that there
Yeah.
isn't time for re-entrance.
There is no time for re-entrance. Yeah.
So you have this very rapid feed. Simon Thorpe,
Yeah.
you know, has argued this strongly.
Yeah.
This very, very subliminal.
Yeah.
Recognition, for example, the ability to distinguish between an animal even faced within
It's
150 milliseconds.
so rapid that it
It's
cannot.
far too rapid
Yeah.
to require a network to set.
Yeah.
For there to be re-entrant
Yes.
feedback information.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it has to be a feed forward
It
system.
has to be feed forward.
So-
Yeah.
I was going to ask this, that says to me that the kind of network architecture looking at has to be to do with longer latency and processing.
Mhm.
The brain isn't fast enough for it to mediate something like the recognition of a defensive or aggressive body posture within 120 milliseconds. That requires a first pass through.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. But I mean, I see activity in the brain as like a flash in a pan. You know, I mean, everything is not everything, but I mean, there's like a massive involvement together of all those areas, and not some passing through, not some handing on from them, because all the stuff we know conflicts with the classical box models, where first you identify like the typical N170 for face, right? I mean, entry into the face system, and then we process attributes, and then it just can't work like that. I mean, we would all be dead.
Thank you.
Someone else had a question.
Yeah, so your question reminded me of quite a few thoughts about what you meant. I think on one slide you said something like you identified, if this is the like 75 networks for your ICAD composition
Yeah.
of the BOLD series. So for each data set, whatever data set that is from whatever study, you have an ICAD decomposition of that
Yes.
BOLD signal to produce a series of orthogonal networks.
Yes.
And you aren't interested in necessarily the connectivity within each region that gets identified in the ICAD composition, more so interested in just the BOLD pattern for that set of regions, correct? And that's what you're calling a network.
Yeah.
And so if your networks are task specific, and because they're task specific, do you think that they're generalizable to some of the things you're interested in studying, because they seem so tuned to the data set? ICA is really powerful to make something orthogonal to model things differently, but I wonder, because of the approach of that, would those 75 networks always be present? Does that feel plausible to you that there's that?
I have no reason for thinking that's implausible in the current state of our knowledge. I mean, anyway, when with ICA, you're always going to find a whole bunch of networks, and then you look at the ones that are specific for the things you're interested in, and there for maybe I didn't spell that out in sufficient detail. Anyway, that's a published paper. That's Progress in Neurobiology, something like that. We have two networks that are relevant for what we are interested in out of the 75 that are stable enough, because you get with that approach, you get a bunch of networks that are very unstable. So we have to test them for stability and things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they seem to come out in studies these things.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Sure. Oh, is it that? Yes.
We're over.
Oh, we're over. I'm sorry.
Let us thank our speaker and there's time on your schedule tomorrow and possibly late today if there's people who have to talk about that out.